Today we're going to be starting a unit on evolution. We're starting with chapter 17, which we're going to break up into two parts, and we're going to be discussing where the evidence comes from for evolution. As always, take notes during this. You can always pause, rewind if you need to, and go back, and bring questions to class if you have anything you want to talk about. So make notes of those questions during the video. We're going to start with the idea of how evolution was first discovered, and how it is that people came up with this idea that species are somehow related to each other. Well, it all starts with the idea of species itself, which is a very, very old idea. People have been talking about species for a long time. We've been naming them, cats and dogs, elephants, giraffes, all these things. It's a very basic concept in biology, this idea of a species. And once people had the idea of species, it's not too big of a stretch to notice that not all species are the same. A giraffe and an elephant are very different from each other. And so when we start discussing those differences, some ideas start to kind of bounce around in people's heads. And in a very similar way, then we discover some similarities. These are, when we use giraffes and elephants as an example, they both feed their young with milk. They both have hair on them. And now today we have the idea of mammal, we understand that. But back in the early days of scientific discoveries, these were some pretty groundbreaking thoughts, but also things that were so basic that even a child could notice some of these similarities and differences. Well, it may be something a child can do, but the name for it's pretty complex. It's called comparative morphology. Comparative meaning we are comparing things. Ology is a study of, and morph means form or shape. So if we are comparing shapes and saying something like the neck of a giraffe is much longer than the neck of an elephant, that'd be some comparative morphology. And we can get really detailed, or we can do it at a simpler level. But this has led to the discovery of evolution. And if we take just one example here in picture form, we can talk about the hands of different animals that we call primates. And all the way over on the right, we can see what a human hand looks like. Well, if we look at these other hands, we can see some definite similarities. Sometimes some similarities are kind of eerie to some people. But as we move further to the left, some of these species, like the gibbon's thumb, we see a very different attachment point in the gibbon's thumb. And the tarsier, you can't even really find a thumb. It's not truly a primate. It has some similarities enough that we consider these things related. The idea of these things being related to each other and the explanation for that relationship is what evolution is all about. Well, when we do comparative morphology, sometimes we may take something like this. We look at how a fish develops over time. Here we have the early embryonic stage of a fish, a little later stage as it's still inside the egg, and then what it might look like after it's hatched. Well, for now, I'm going to cover up those later stages, and we're going to take a look at several different embryos and do some comparative morphology. As we look at each of these, they all look quite similar. We can see an eye structure in each one. We can see a tail structure inside the tail. We can actually see what looks like some very simple little vertebrae in there. And these little bumpy things that show up in each one, those aren't legs or anything. Those are actually what we call gill slits. Those are areas that may or may not develop into actual gills. Now, if we look at these embryos when they've gone through some time, and the amount of time may vary from one to another, we start to see some differences. Now, they already weren't all exactly alike, but over time they become less alike. These two over here are definitely becoming much more different than the other four. And if we kind of go across and reveal what species these are one at a time, we already saw the fish. The next one is an amphibian, something like a salamander perhaps. We've got a tortoise, and you can see the shell developing there on his back. We can look at a chick, a rabbit, and a human. Kind of a creepy alien-looking human, I think, but that is supposed to represent an early-stage human. And in each one of these, we see more differences the further along in their development they are, but in the early embryological stages, we see a lot more similarities. This type of comparative morphology is sometimes called embryology when we're studying embryos. And this particular drawing is a very famous drawing that's been around for quite a while when people are talking about discussing how similar and different these different embryos are. Now, as we're talking about the discovery of evolution, an idea that comes up pretty easily is the idea of fossils. Fossils were a major clue in people understanding how evolution had taken place, and just simply understanding that it had taken place. Because in fossils, we also see some morphological similarities and differences. And when you're looking for fossils, pretty quickly people understand as they're digging down in the layers of rock that there are different layers. As you're digging down, you may see different colors, different textures, different types of rock at different levels. And in each layer, we see different amounts of similarity, different amounts of differences. And in fact, when you go deeper and deeper into the rock, you find species that are less and less like what currently surviving species are like. So, if we look at the different rock layers, up at the top here, we might find some skulls of things that are similar to like a modern human or some other modern vertebrates. As you dig your way down, you see some things that we don't discover anywhere on Earth. Sometimes some things that seem kind of bizarre to us based on our familiarity with what's currently alive on Earth. So the idea quickly came about that species haven't always been the same. Somehow those species are changing. And that is, in a nutshell, what evolution is, a change in species over time. So if we take something like horses and what we've kind of come to hypothesize in terms of the history of horses, over here on the right we have modern horses. Over time, if we go back in time millions of years, we see what we believe are the ancestors of modern horses, which are much smaller. They have a slightly different body shape. They have more toes per foot, whereas modern horses only have one toe per foot. And the early ancestor that we recognized as being probably the ancestor of modern horses actually in many ways looks more like a dog, a modern dog, than it does more like a modern horse. But then that also may help us understand how dogs and horses can be related to each other. Well, most people are pretty familiar with Darwin. We're going to be talking about Darwin in part 2 of this chapter. But there are some other ideas that were out there, and these ideas are often called theories. I've put the word theories in quotation marks because they aren't truly anything that was ever considered a true theory. They were never recognized as theories by scientists as a whole, but they were some hypotheses that had some fairly famous people backing them, and in some cases, lots of people that felt they were pretty good ideas. So we'll take a look at a couple of these older ideas right here now. And these are a couple of the more famous ones. And this is primarily during like the early to mid 1800s that these ideas were out here. It really was in the late 1700s to early 1800s that people were starting to take a look at the idea of evolution. And we're looking to try to find some way to explain it. One of the first people who came up with what seemed like a pretty good explanation to some people was a Frenchman by the name of Georges Cuvier. And Cuvier believed that there was a one-time creation when all species were created. So every species on Earth was created all at one time. And then periodically through Earth's history, there had been certain major events, major catastrophes or disaster that would wipe out some of those species. This would explain what had happened to the dinosaurs, because when people were finding dinosaur fossils, they needed some explanation as to where these had gone. And the idea, the theory, if you want to call it that, is called catastrophism, with the emphasis on those catastrophes that killed off many species. Now, there are different ways people interpret Cuvier's ideas today. Obviously, we can't ask him exactly what his ideas were, but Cuvier's ideas seem to really focus on ways to understand the Bible as a science textbook. So the creation story in the beginning of Genesis would explain how everything was made, and then events like the Great Flood that's described in the Bible would explain where certain species have gone to. Some people feel that maybe wasn't truly the explanation he was given, but Cuvier did definitely have some strong Christian beliefs. And one idea that, again, most people interpret in terms of Cuvier's writings about catastrophism is that he did not believe that species changed. So if you find these older species fossils that look different than modern ones, those are ones he would believe that had become extinct. His explanation for why we don't find modern fossils in those deeper down layers, things like human fossils down mixed in with the dinosaurs and that, would be just the fact that we hadn't found those yet. If we kept on looking, eventually he felt we would find those. Now in the early 1800s, that was a pretty good explanation. Today we know that simply can't be the case, where as we find more and more and more fossils, Cuvier's ideas become less and less sensible in terms of explaining what we're seeing and what our observations are. Another fairly famous scientist who came up with a lot of ideas about how species change was another Frenchman by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Lamarck's key concept was that if you acquired characteristics during your lifetime, you would pass those down to your offspring. Now, I often like to take this to an extreme case and say, Let's say when you're growing up, you learn how to juggle really, really well. Well, according to Lamarck's ideas, evidently, if you acquired the characteristic of being a good juggler, your offspring would be born knowing how to juggle. Might explain why there are many families in the circus who kind of pass their skills along, but it doesn't make much sense biologically. Another idea that Lamarck had related to this was that he felt that life began very simply, and over time we got more and more complex forms. Now that's a pretty good explanation in terms of what we see in the fossil record. Instead of saying like Cuvier that we simply hadn't found the right fossils yet, he was saying we're finding the fossils and life is becoming more complex. However, his explanation as to how it got there was a little bit unusual. He kind of felt that organisms had an inner desire to get better and eventually to reach this form that he would consider perfection. Now, in Lamarck's views, evidently humans were the perfect species and other species that were striving to become like humans. Now, that makes sense maybe in some areas of the fossil record, but definitely not in others. To explain how giraffes got longer necks, he would often explain that some giraffes in their lifetime grew longer necks, and then they had babies with long necks. In fact, a lot of even modern people still today think that's what the theory of evolution explains. It definitely does not, as we will see later on in this chapter. But that idea of a giraffe with a stretched neck having tall offspring was kind of appealing if tall giraffes are more perfect than shorter giraffes. I don't know, can someone who wants to become a good juggler, can they maybe grow extra hands if they desire to become a better juggler? I don't know if it makes a lot of sense. He had a pseudo-scientific explanation for how this would take place. He thought there was some substance that he called fluida flowing through our nerves. Back in Lamarck's time period, we still didn't have a good explanation for what nerves really did or how they worked, so he felt there was some substance in there that brought about these changes. And if a giraffe got a long neck, it would be a buildup of fluida in its neck to make the neck get longer and longer. Now, if Lamarck's ideas were true, we should really be able to prove this pretty easily by causing animals to acquire certain traits. And there were scientists in Lamarck's time who were very opposed to his teachings, and one of them, by the name of August Weismann, came along and publicly disproved Lamarck by taking a collection of lab mice and cutting their tails off, which would be an acquired trait, and then showing their babies were born with tails. And Lamarck didn't really give up on his ideas very quickly. He insisted this would take some time, so Weismann did this to a few generations of mice, subjecting mice to kind of a cruel experiment there. But in the process did prove that this simply didn't make sense and it doesn't work. In the second half of chapter 17, we're going to take a look at a much better explanation, an explanation that's been tested for over 150 years and is standing up very nicely and still seems to be a very valid way to explain how evolution is taking place. So remember, bring your questions to class and have a great day.